Good evening. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School of Government. And just as important to me, I am a former New York Timesman. Was there for a decade, and I also, with my wife, wrote a book about the New York Times. So I feel especially proud tonight to present this group to you. These are all distinguished journalists from the New York Times to talk about something that I know was a very memorable and powerful event in all of our lives 10 years ago. This is the first event to commemorate 9/11, the 10th anniversary of 9/11 that Harvard is doing. It's also the opening program for the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School. So we feel like it's a rip-roaring way to get started, and you have a terrific panel. To moderate the panel and to introduce the other panelists is Rick Berke, who is a friend of long-standing to the Kennedy School, a very distinguished journalist who has covered politics in very many ways over many years at the New York Times and is now the national editor. I think that it is particularly fitting, and I may be prejudiced in this, for this panel to be a New York Times panel, because one of the things that happened on 9/11, as well as all the terrible things, was that it was a moment in journalistic terms that was extraordinary. Extraordinary in its difficulty to cover and extraordinary in its importance. There was a lot of good journalism done, but the journalism of the New York Times, I believe, would be fair to say, stood out above all other. That year, the New York Times won an unprecedented 7 Pulitzer Prizes, 6 of them for coverage of 9/11. What you may not know is that the Times was also a finalist in 5 other categories for a Pulitzer Prize, several of them related to 9/11. I think that the Times, without question, was a newspaper that took this as a mission of great importance and came through. It really knocked it out of the park. We've had a lot of time now to reflect on those days, and tonight, with Rick Berke in command, I think that we have a very interesting opportunity to think about it again. Rick.
Thanks, Alex. I'm thrilled that Alex is here because it's all New York Times, 24/7. That's what we like. And I know you're all New York Times readers, aren't you, right? So these 3 bylines should be very familiar. They're 3 of our most talented, most best-known, most prominent writers and reporters, and among the best not only at the Times but in American journalism. Starting at the end is Jim Dow, who covers military and veterans affairs. He's had a range of assignments since joining the Times in '92. He was a Pentagon reporter during 9/11, later embedded with Special Operations Forces during the invasion of Iraq in '03. He's covered the State Department, Congress, national politics, was deputy metropolitan editor, and even Albany bureau chief. And we have Laurie Goodstein, who has been our national religion reporter since 1997. There is no reporter anywhere who's more plugged in about religion, in not only America, but around the world. When the Pope sneezes, people turn to Laurie. Before coming to the Times, she was a reporter for years at the Washington Post. Beyond looking at major religious institutions, Laurie looks for stories that bring to life how Americans live out their faith in an age of increasing religious diversity. And next to me is Dan Barry, who is in the pantheon of breathtaking writers at the Times, but he's also known as, I know he hates this, but you know, it's true. So, but he's also known as a skilled investigative reporter. He writes the This Land column for the National Desk. In fact, he inaugurated this column, traveling the country to write on a range of subjects, large and small. Before that, Dan wrote the About New York column and has served in many capacities, City Hall bureau chief, among other assignments. I'm going to give you a plug, you'll be happy. His most recent book came out this year to sensational reviews, Bottom of the 33rd, Hope, Redemption, and Baseball's Longest Game.
Related to this, right?
Related to this, but I just had to. So anyway, let me just say at the outset, you know, every one of us here remembers 9/11, and we all have our own individual experiences. And I think by having this group of reporters, the three of them have just very interesting perspectives from that day, from the days and months after 9/11, and from their years of coverage, in the 10 years since. And all three of them also have written stories for our special commemorative New York Times edition that's coming out on 9/11, and they can give you a little sneak preview at the end of what they've found 10 years later. I wanted to tell you one thing about my own experience, not about 9/11, but a pre-9/11 experience. I was a political reporter for the Times, and on the front page of the New York Times the Sunday before 9/11, I had a story, and the headline was, Bush's aides seek to focus efforts on the economy. And the whole story was about how the administration was drifting, and he wasn't sure what issues to focus on. It didn't mention terrorism or anything else. And it's just looking back how since that Sunday, or since that Tuesday, how the world has so changed. It's just remarkable. And let me start, related to that, start with Jim, because related to my experience of writing that story before 9/11, he was on a whole different assignment covering the Pentagon right before 9/11, and he was in all places. He was in Alaska. Tell them why you were in Alaska, and looking back, it's like totally was the wrong place to be.
Or maybe it was the right place, depending on perspective, I guess. Yeah, I have one of the stranger 9/11 stories, I guess. I had absolutely nothing to do with the coverage of the day or the days after because I was stuck on Kodiak Island in Alaska. But it is kind of interesting in the same way that Rick's story the week before 9/11 is, in that I had gone there as a Pentagon reporter to write about the creation, the initial construction of a missile defense system in Alaska, and that was missile defense was a concept that Ronald Reagan had been burning to do, and his followers for years had wanted to build it, and when George Bush became president, it became the focus of one of the focuses of the military at the time, and missile defense says everything about what was then the old military and is now what is now today the old military, but was then a very controversial and significant thing. And the whole idea was to shoot down missiles that might be fired. Originally, the idea was that the Soviet Union would be shooting them, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was North Korea and then maybe somebody else. And so there I was interviewing people on Kodiak Island about how much they hated the idea of having this missile defense system built in central Alaska when I was checking out the next morning, and I looked at the television screen behind the clerk's desk, and this was a tiny little, almost bed and breakfast type place, and I see I forget which tower it was, burning, and I said, my God, what happened? And she said, oh, a plane flew into it. And I said, was it on purpose? And she looked at me and said, well, yes, of course. And so she says to me, I think you should keep your room. So I was there, and I was stuck there for a good week because no planes were moving anywhere. And as I was just telling Rick and Dan and Laurie before this, it was there was no I couldn't reach anybody by phone for days. We had television though, and I would sat in my room watching these scenes of New York, just utter destruction, and it was the most frustrating experience I think I've ever had in my life. So frustrating, in fact, that a friend and there was a colleague a former colleague who was at the LA Times who happened to be at Kodiak Island on the same day. It was the strangest coincidence. We went out and started interviewing people in Kodiak Island so we had something to do. People were doing memorials in Alaska over 9/11, and so I went and interviewed them and sent a memo. I have no idea whether it even reached New York. But I finally, this is probably more than you wanted to know, but we finally got back maybe a week later, and then it was all about going to war, and it was down Rumsfeld's Pentagon, and that's what we did for the next 3 years, was cover preparations for the invasion of Afghanistan, and then as soon as that was over, everything just flowed right into the preparations for Iraq.
What stands out for you? I mean, you were one of the first to cover Guantanamo and the invasion, all these. I mean, of all that blur of stories over those years, is there anyone that sort of you want to recall that was sort of most riveting? Anything you observed or?
Well, I mean, there were a couple, I suppose. Eventually, I went to Afghanistan after the Taliban had been kicked out, and I remember touring the borderlands of near Pakistan at the time with the American general at the time, and he just kind of pointed up at the snow-capped mountains and said, "They're still there." You know, we chased them over the mountains, but they're still there, and the regrouping, and that's been the story ever since.
Laurie, it strikes me that I'm looking at a story that you wrote on 9/11 that was in the paper the next day. In the face of suspicion and discrimination, Muslims struggled to assert their identities as loyal American citizens and to say that their religion does not approve of violence against innocents. And this is something that we heard about, years and years and since then. I mean, can you talk a little about how just in that instant, Muslims were, as you say, transformed to a national target of suspicion and hate? What was that like? Tell us about that day.
I was surprised you asked us to go back and look at what we did that day. And when I read that lead, I thought, boy, you could write that now and it would still be a valid story. It's as though Muslims are still a target of suspicion and hate, and it happened instantly. It happened, I would say, between the first plane hitting and the second plane hitting, because at that point you knew it was terrorism, and when we knew it was terrorism, immediately the assumption was it was Islamic terrorism. And so that story was produced, in the midst of all the horror and confusion from the office. I was not out at the Trade Center site, but immediately the Muslim story in America changed. There had been a Muslim story before 9/11. It's maybe easy to forget that, but one of the first stories that I did when I came to the Times, one of the first that made the front page, was about, I'll mention it because it was very typical of the stories that were done about Muslims before 9/11. The frame was, are Muslims assimilating? Are they becoming Americanized? How are they struggling to balance the drive to retain their traditions and their faith with becoming Americans in this country? How are they raising their children? So the piece I did was about a woman who was a flight attendant for US Airways and had been fired because she started to wear a headscarf. So these were the kinds of stories we did about Muslims before 9/11. So the assimilation story, it went from a story about assimilation and about Americanization of one of many immigrant and minority religious groups in this country. Muslims were one of many, to being the, not only a big fat target, but also being almost a national obsession, I would say, where, in every community suddenly people were wondering, I have a Muslim doctor, I have, there's a guy, at the 7-Eleven, do we have to fear these people? And so this was going on. Muslims are not just in New York; they're all over. There are Muslim communities all throughout the country. And so the story that I wrote that day, which was immediately Muslims sensed that they were in this precarious position. Sometimes they sensed it because they went out on the street and were the targets of, sometimes harassment, comments, and sometimes violence. It is startling to read the headlines in the couple weeks after to look at how much direct violence there was targeted at Muslims, even children, kids in school, that, it is like it erupted out of nowhere. There was this rage. So that story on day one was about Muslims anticipating that and fearing that, and wondering how do we prevent that from happening, and how should we carry on?
How did this story come about? Did you immediately anticipate that this might happen, or was it, because it's pretty striking looking back that you did this day one.
Yeah. There, I don't know if it came out from conversations in the newsroom, but it didn't take a lot. I went uptown to a store and overheard this horrible, conversation happen in the store that's recounted in that story, where, a Muslim woman is saying, this happened because of American foreign policy. And then people jumping on her and saying, no, it happened because Muslims are terrible people, and, Muslims are violent. And, in some ways, I think that kind of open dissension was only capable of happening like right afterward in the flame of the moment. I think those kinds of conversations, I think people suppress themselves a lot, but there was a lot of anger being expressed in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dan, you were a reporter on the Metro desk on 9/11. Can you tell us what you did that day and take us through what you saw?
Sure. It was primary day in New York, and so no one remembers that, but we were about to elect at least a Democratic candidate for the successor to Rudolph Giuliani. You may have heard of him. He was the mayor at that time. And so a lot of the reporters were working late. They were coming in later in the afternoon. And so I was just being a knucklehead at home in New Jersey, and I had just come in from a run, and someone called and told my wife and me what had happened. And so I knew I had to go. And I didn't pack anything, and I wish I had. And so I just started driving, and all the roads, all the highways were blocked off almost immediately. They put dump trucks and cement trucks in front of all the roads leading into New York. So I drove through some back roads and wound up in Weehawken, New Jersey, about a mile from the Hudson River, and then ran downhill. And as I got down to the water, there were hundreds of people coming off ferries. And some of these people, the Circle Line ferries, which usually go around Manhattan as kind of a tourism thing, were now shuttling people off Manhattan Island. And I suspect that some of these people coming to New Jersey weren't even from New Jersey. They were just getting the hell off the island. And so there's hundreds of people coming off the docks. And so I ran through them, and I got to the ferry captain, and I said, hey, can I get a ride over? He said, sure, and no one else is asking, really. And so the ferry pulls out, and it's really, I'll never forget this. There was the crew of about four men. There was me, and all I knew was I had to get to the newsroom. And there was a guy, and he was holding a brown paper bag, and he clearly was suffering from some kind of shock, because his mission was to bring his wife her lunch. Okay, so then we're going across the Hudson, and then the ferry stopped in the middle of the Hudson because it was waiting for a berth to open up, because many ferries were just getting people the hell off the island. And so it just paused in the Hudson, and you looked south, and of course you saw, the pier. It was just plumes of black smoke, and there was just silence on the Hudson. We just looked at it. There was no comment. It was just looking at it. And so then it got to a pier finally, and I stepped off the boat, and there's Jim Dwyer. He's doing the same thing. He's going to go to the newsroom. So we went to the newsroom, and for the next 3 days, I think, I did rewrite. I did all sorts of stories. The first one I remember is, okay, Dan, you're in charge of the response, the rush to the hospitals with all the wounded. Okay, so I'm focusing on St. Vincent Hospital. I'm focusing on contacting doctors. There were battalions of ambulances and doctors all at the ready. And of course, as we know now, ain't a hell of a lot of victims. In fact, I don't think they had many victims at all, because everyone was pretty much dead who had not escaped. And so that was the first story, was, there wasn't much of an issue with victims. And then, I just kept writing day after day, and there are other reporters who were, down at Ground Zero, what came to be known as Ground Zero, and they stayed for days. They never left because they shut down the city south of Chambers Street, first Canal Street and then Chambers Street. And so Chris Chivers, brilliant reporter and a colleague of mine at the Providence Journal years ago, was effectively embedded with the National Guard that was bivouacked at Battery Park. You got to get your brain around that, right? And so he did it for a few days, and then I cycled in, and it was all kind of like secret, even though the subway, the one train, or rather the 6 train was running, we weren't supposed to be there. And so he and I, traded positions. Now I had his tent down at Battery Park. I had a construction helmet and a clipboard, and I basically walked around the site for 3 or 4 days, just chronicling everything I saw, and it was astounding. Some of it, most of you probably can already imagine. And whenever journalism students ask me, what's the story that's most memorable to you? It's a story that I wrote while down there, and it was, ran on the inside. It wasn't played terribly prominently by the Times. But when the towers collapsed, it sent out billows and billows of this kind of yellow dust. Okay, just imagine what the dust is. If you think about it, you'll go mad. So this dust came down, and then it went all over the place, all over Lower Manhattan. And so when I was there, I noticed that the dust was on all the buildings, on Barclay Street, Greenwich Street, Liberty Street, and people had written messages in the dust. Vernon Cherry, call home. God bless you, Dana, Mom. Things like that. And I went around, I don't know why I did this, but I went around and chronicled as much as I could of that, because I knew it was ephemeral. Do you know what I mean? I knew it was ephemeral, but I also knew it was raw. And I knew in a couple of days, when the city got its act together, they'd spray it off. And in fact, one of the vivid memories of mine is when I was there. I think it was on Liberty Street. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and the firefighters had found another body. And at that time, they thought there were still people alive, and they'd hear cell phones, or they thought they heard cell phones, or they'd see flickerings of light, and they thought it was someone trying to signal from the rubble. And so it was still very raw. And I'm standing there really astounded and not sure how to process all this. And a guy came by, a city sanitation worker, passed by me, and he's pushing a broom. And he was cleaning the street.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Wow. Jim spent the last year doing an amazing series called A Year of War, embedded with troops in Afghanistan, and just giving a close-in look at their attitudes, how they, leaving home, being away from their families, how it affected their lives. And I'm curious, you've also spent, over the years after 9/11, a lot of time with the troops. How has their attitudes towards this country and our sort of military policy post 9/11 changed in terms of your own direct observations over the years?
Well, I write about this a little bit in the piece that'll be in the 9/11 package. I think there's little question that a lot of young people signed up right after 9/11 just out of a huge mixture of powerful emotions, but the desire to do something was sort of common to a lot of them. And what that boiled down to for each individual varied. I mean, for some it was pure unadulterated anger and a desire to get back by fighting somehow. But for others, it was a much more, there was a sense that the country had been attacked and that they felt it was, that they should play a role in trying to defend it. And so I think there in those months, and probably really for a couple of years after 9/11, I think a lot of young people who maybe would not have dreamed of joining the military, but perhaps who had, it had been a passing thought, but not something that they considered very seriously, or maybe they had military in their families, but it was something that wasn't expected of them necessarily. I think a lot of those people, they were moved in various ways to sign up. And I think in that period, I don't know this for a fact, but it's sort of a gut sense that it was a very, very diverse military. There was a very, and again, I'm sort of talking, off the top of my head here, but my sense is that you had people from a broader range of class and more different regions of the country, and a broader range of educational background joining the military. And then I think that all changed again when Iraq went sour. The military's ability to enlist dropped way down. It was dawning on people that maybe they had supported the mission in Afghanistan, maybe they had supported at the beginning of Iraq, but Iraq, when it became clear that it was no longer kicking out Saddam Hussein, but you were battling a terrible sectarian civil war, and troops weren't even always fighting; they were just getting blown up by faceless, hidden bombs every day. That it became much more difficult to recruit that sort of diverse body of troops that they had, and I think a lot of the people that started joining up at that time were probably more purely for economic reasons. Has always been a major reason for people joining the military, but people who felt they had no other choice in life but to sign up, and I think to some degree, you always find people who enlist or who go into the officer corps who are very idealistic. There's some amazingly idealistic people. But I think it was a much higher percentage in those years right after the war.
Just bring it up to this week. What's your
9/11.
take on the Pentagon, those the guidelines that came out this week about how we commemorate 9/11 and what the message is for a domestic audience and a foreign audience?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the guidelines, I'll be honest with you. But I think there's a concern that there not be a sense of that there were, and I think this was drummed into troops throughout the decade that there were good reasons and bad reasons to go to war. I think they've always tried to at least send out the message that this wasn't a war on Islam. For better or worse, they tried to get out that message anyway. And so, the Pentagon thinks a lot about how it's perceived and how their actions are viewed by the world. So.
Okay, Laurie, from your reporting, is there anything positive to say about religious relations since 9/11? Is there anything positive that's come out of this?
It's a counterintuitive thought that there could be something positive because, especially in the last year since the controversy over the mosque at near Ground Zero, I don't want to call it the mosque at Ground Zero because the people who created it never intended for it to be that. But that incident, it's as though it allowed all this latent prejudice and hatred and fear of Islam to erupt in this country at a time where many people thought we'd kind of gotten past that. So given that we're still, I think, recovering from that, as only a year ago, you see a real entrenched movement, I would say, and it's very much at the grassroots. It's communities all over the country where there are very active organizations that are promoting this idea that Islam itself is a religion to be rejected from this country, and that Muslims are not compatible with democracy and America and the Constitution. It sort of dovetailed with the Tea Party. There's a lot of Tea Party influence and involvement in that. So, to say that there's anything positive going on in the midst of all that is it's not immediately apparent. But what I have seen is that in a lot of communities where there have been like battles over mosques, either mosques that want to be, Muslim organizations that want to build a mosque or want to renovate a mosque, there's been, and there's been opposition to those mosques that's very, very strong. There's also been a counterforce from American religious groups that have joined forces with Muslims. And that happened pretty soon after 9/11. You saw kind of a flowering of the interfaith movement going on. The interfaith movement in America has always been very active, but it was kind of, initially it was Christians of different faiths. At that point it was ecumenicism. Then they, bring in the Jews. It was an interfaith movement. But after 9/11, Muslims really began to also participate in their communities and interfaith organizations. And so there's been many, many relationships that have been built. Sometimes very, very personal, very intimate relationships, people talking in living rooms over, about their different faith traditions, about scripture, getting to know each other. And all those relationships that have been built in the last 9-10 years, I think, have provided a bulwark, again, that has helped counter the Islamophobia, if you want to call it that. Because wherever you've seen controversies over mosques being built and a real uproar, there has also been this counterforce, and usually the counterforce is rabbis, priests, ministers, along with the imams, standing up and saying, this is not the America we want, and there's no reason that this, Muslim community can't have its house of worship. So I see in all this, and this is the theme of the piece that I did for the commemorative edition that we're doing on 9/11. I see a kind of a positive development out of 9/11 in that, people of different faiths, because they had to, reached out to each other. Muslims particularly were kind of in a phase, when 9/11 happened, they were in a phase of kind of building their community, and they were very, they'll tell me now and they'll admit, they were very turned inward. I mean, they were working on their, Sunday schools, or they were working on building the mosque, or they were working on helping, newcomers who were arriving. They were not so much turned outward and looking to build bridges. 9/11 made them realize we need allies, and we need people to know who we are, so we better reach out. So, I don't mean to be Pollyannish about it, because I think that the reality for, many Muslims in America is still, that they do face prejudice and bigotry, but there is also this kind of, lovely relationship building that has gone on, and that you're seeing the impact of that in city councils and in school boards and places where people are making decisions about, accommodations for Muslims in America. So, not an apparent thought, not necessarily one everybody would agree with, because the Islamophobia and that whole movement, I could talk about some more later, but it's very, very strong.
I wanted to read from one of many stories Dan did in the days after, and one is, this one caught my attention. It's about the Circle Line cruise. I don't know if it's a famous boat that goes around Manhattan, and Dan took a ride soon after 9/11, and he wrote, "What had once been an ooh and ah celebration of Gotham and its glory has now become a somber glide past a communal burial ground, as well as a dramatic reminder that for all its skyscraping splendor, New York City is so naked and vulnerable that it needs soldiers and gun turrets to guard its shores." And my question for you is, you're writing about this sort of unnerving scene. How did this sort of up-close coverage, day after day, week after week, affect you emotionally?
It's not a surprise to anyone who does journalism that, you immediately go into kind of an impersonal mode in a weird way. It's a protective thing. You immerse yourself into the situation, and then it's later that it hits you. I've been studying Jimmy Breslin, for example, and Breslin, one of his attributes is that he would really immerse himself into the streets of New York, and he would go to the difficult neighborhoods and really get involved in people's lives, and then come back, write the story, and then his wife told me he would go and he would have to take to bed. You know, it would affect him after he had filed. With me, I was fine, you know, for 3 or 4 days. It was a story. It's a story. I got to take care of the story. And then a friend of mine that I had known since grammar school called me up, and he said, "Hey, Danny, they can't find Terrence." And this is Brian McShane, and his brother Terrence was a firefighter who died. And when he told me that, that was my moment to lose it. And after that, I began to feel, not with any arrogance or anything, but the need to bear witness to what had happened to the greatest city in the world. You know, it was my contention for a full year that you can't blow a hole in the side of Manhattan and then just move on. Do you know what I mean? And so, it wasn't meant to be arrogant, but this is how I processed it. And so I spent a lot of time at the medical examiner's office, and so all sorts of, the positive things that happened from 9/11, the medical examiner's office developed ad hoc a way to deal with mass tragedy like this, and it's now the template around the country for when great disaster happens. They have a system in place. I mean, the bodies were coming in. There were there were dentists here with dental, matching charts. There were forensic anthropologists here, DNA charts. They had it all worked out, and it's now the template. Then I felt the need to go to the landfill in Staten Island, a virtual village. It's 10 years, and it seems like a dream, some of it, but there was a village built on the top of a landhill in Staten Island. And when you were driving on 278 through Staten Island, you'd look up late at night, and you see this glow on the top of a landfill, and where there were 50 years of New York City garbage, there was now a village where hundreds and hundreds of people in hazmat suits were working through all the debris that was trucked up to the top of the landfill, and they were looking for not only body parts, but they were looking for anything that could help identify someone or could be returned to someone. And they had these huge conveyor belts. And I spent a lot of time up there, and you would walk past stacks of police cars crushed, and a few fire engines that were crushed. Then you would come around and you'd see dozens of people in hazmat suits, just picking through stuff, looking for a license, a driver's license or something like that. So I think that I had my moment with Terrence McShane, and then I think there was a sense of bearing witness and also a sense of anger, I have to admit, that this happened, but I'm going to write about it. And I wanted to look at the human impact, whether at the medical examiner's office, at the landfill, or in the families that I wrote about.
Did you both feel that sense of anger as well as you were reporting this, or how did that manifest itself? Or were you able to keep your journalistic distance?
I don't think I ever felt anger, but I wasn't in New York, and I think it would have made a big difference being in New York and seeing that every day and seeing the city just so unbelievably scarred in that way. I have a hard time imagining it. I mean, the closest thing I can think of is like being in New Orleans and Katrina, and where I felt a visceral anger about a variety of things. For me, it was just an immediate sense that our world is utterly, completely changed. I have no idea how it's changed. I can guess, but it's going to be dramatically different in ways I can't imagine. And I felt that immediate, the second it became clear what had happened.
I'm having a hard time with that question because it's bringing back what I felt at the time, which was not so much anger, but numb. It's like I was a zombie or something. I did live in Manhattan, and we had just moved into an apartment on the west side, overlooking the West Side Highway with wonderful windows, but right at highway level. and they had blocked off the highway, and for weeks, the only thing on that highway was trucks carrying the debris. And we didn't have curtains. In fact, we never invested in curtains. And so every night, you would see the lights, the flashing emergency lights from the trucks as they made their way up, kind of, echoing on the white walls that we didn't paint, we didn't curtain. And within a year, I moved out of Manhattan, and I think that that's part of the reason that we moved to the suburbs. It definitely pushed me over the edge. I had to get out, and I didn't quite know why, and I think a lot of it had to do with 9/11.
I do think that writing about it was a way of processing. I think so many people in New York and probably around the country felt numb, as you say, and also felt powerless. And at least we were able to get lost in going out and reporting and seeing it and chronicling it. And I think we had this sense, certainly in the newsroom. My desk faced south in the old New York Times building, and for weeks, and we always had the windows open, David Dunlap and I, and for weeks you could smell the acrid air coming north, up, and you knew what it was, And this wasn't just a couple of days, this is for weeks. So in retrospect, I think that I wound up processing it better than I think some friends of mine who are not in journalism have.
Can you talk about your Relics project for this special section?
The question that was posed to some the readers of the New York Times was, what did you save from 9/11? And it was my term, the idea of relics, I suppose. And the first relic, if you think about it, all you have to do now is drive down the FDR Drive on the east side, and when you're hitting the low 30s, look to your right, and you'll see a huge white tent. And it doesn't look like it looks almost like a circus tent. And it's behind Bellevue and next to the medical examiner's office. And within that tent, there's a little makeshift chapel, and it's been there for almost 10 years now. And in there as well are 2 or 3 refrigerated trucks with 14,000 remains, 9,000 of which have not been identified yet. And so the medical examiner's office, to this day, is still trying to figure out how to identify these body parts. Some family members don't want the body parts. They've already received a part of a loved one, and they're done. Other family members want everything. That's one of the complicated aspects of this. And the larger question we put to our readers was, well, what did you save? And it's not just things from 9/11. It's not just a cop standing there right before the towers collapse and a piece of paper floats down and lands at his feet, and he picks it up, and it's a single page from the Manhattan telephone book. And it has 900 names of people he doesn't know, but he links it to what is happening at the World Trade Center. It's been blown out of the World Trade Center, but it's before the collapse. And he folds it up, puts it in his memo pad, and has it to this day. He kept that because, it's a worthless piece of paper, but to him, it's extremely precious. So there's that. And it's not just New York. It's not just the guy who scooped up some dust in the street and has it in an envelope to this day sitting on his desk. And he doesn't know what to do with it. And he doesn't want to put it in a glass jar. He wants it to be humble because he knows what's in that dust. But around the country, people save things from that moment, whether it's a child's drawing. You remember, school children were all asked to try and process this. And there's this children's artwork from that time, and a lot of people have saved that. And then lastly, the relics that all our communities have, and maybe communities where you live have them as well. All the girders, a lot of the debris from 9/11 was trucked to a hangar at JFK Airport, Hangar 17. Tons and tons and tons of girders. And they sat there for years, and the Port Authority wasn't sure what to do with it. They knew they were going to need it for a memorial at some point, some of it. And then they started getting requests from around the country. Gig Harbor, Washington, the fire department in Gig Harbor, Washington, places in Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and certainly all through the tri-state area. They wanted something. So the Port Authority got a court order because it's part of a crime scene. They had to get a court order. And what they did was they began dividing up pieces of girder. And so 1,200 communities around the country and some in Europe have pieces of girder. And they have it on display sometimes in town hall, or they have it at the fire department, or they have it in their local museum. And I've seen video clips of, say, for example, the girder that was sent to Gig Harbor. Firefighters drove 3,000 miles to the hangar. They could not believe what was in the hangar. They're given a girder, they wrap it in a flag, and then they drive it 3,000 miles back, every so often stopping to change the flag and saluting. They kept it very formal. This is, by the way, this is just a few months ago. This wasn't 9 years ago. So 10 years later, it still has this resonance with these people who are on the other side of the country. And as they pulled into Gig Harbor, there were hundreds of people lined up on the streets, and they're all saluting a piece of girder. And then when the girder is placed in front of the fire department, dozens of people lined up, and all they did was touch it.
We're going to turn to questions in a minute. There are microphones all around, so feel free to line up. And remember that we're looking for questions and not statements, and one question per person. So please come on up. And while we're waiting for that, Jim, why don't you describe, is there any one example that stands out from this piece you're writing for next week about any one person you talk to that's a great profile that you want to?
Yeah, sure. I just sort of did little thumbnail profiles of people who, most of them, there's only a handful of them, but several of them are people who joined the military after 9/11. One is the widow of a Marine who was among the first people killed in Iraq, and that piece sort of dwells on how she's come to terms with his death over the years. But the person I like most was a guy from Florida who he had an identical twin, and they actually had grown up in Puerto Rico, had moved to Florida when they were like juniors in high school, and he always wanted to be an astronaut, and he had gotten into the college in Florida where they train astronauts. I didn't know a place like that existed, and was ready to go when 9/11 happened. And he's one of these people I was talking about earlier who something about that event sort of just changed him and altered his way of seeing things, and suddenly it unlocked all these things that he wanted to do. And it wasn't a simple, I want to go and fight. It wasn't as simple as I want to go protect. It was that and other things. He had a sense of adventure. He wanted to see what war was like many young people. He wanted to test himself. But from a guy who hadn't really given much thought at all to joining the military, he quietly, because he knew his parents would hate the idea, they wanted him to go to college, saw recruiters, found out there was a special program to become a Green Beret. You didn't have to spend several years in the Army. You could go straight into the more or less into the Green Beret selection process. And then he talked his twin brother into it as well. And the two of them signed up together and went to Afghanistan. And he's 27, but he sounds like he could be about 38. And I don't mean in a weary way. It's just he's a very sort of mature thinking guy. And he, in the course of his time in Afghanistan, he did one long tour and one short tour. His brother was rather badly injured in one of those tours. He's fine today, but he was in a vehicle rollover, and his face was more or less crushed. But they repaired it. He's fine today. But he's one of these. He's come through it, and he can look back on what he's done, and he doesn't have to. And he has really deep and interesting questions about what we're still doing in Afghanistan, what we're getting out of it. I think there's a lot of people who have served over there who feel like that they feel like they can't justify their time and the time they put themselves at risk if they didn't feel like the entire mission was good. But he's not that way. He can say, look, I have doubts about whether we did anything over there, but I know that I did something in terms of helping some Afghan villagers, and the experience for me was great. And he's come out and he's going to try to go to medical school. And as much as he's not thrilled about our current deployments, he's thinking of going back into the military as a doctor, because he loves being in the military and he wants to serve. So, a really interesting guy.
All right, why don't we go, and please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Umar Shaburov. I am a mid-career student, also a Mason Fellow. I would like to address a question, probably to the entire panel, whoever wishes to answer. We sort of heard one side of the discourse of what really happened in the United States and the stories that happened of people who lived in New York, etc. But what about the discourse of the people and stories that happened outside of the United States, in Europe, in Middle East, in Central Asia, etc.? Have you done stories on that and how it played out against that? And second question that I have is, what is the legacy of Abu Ghraib and how it played against the concept of September 11? If you could.
That's two questions,
Sorry.
but we'll try to squeeze them both in.
Thanks.
Anyone want to take the first one?
Well, I mean, we're all, as much as we all would have probably really loved to write some of those stories about what's happening else in the rest of the world, we were national correspondents and didn't do that. I mean, I agree sort of with the premise of the question, which is we can be so easily focused on how it affected us as Americans, whether we're soldiers or firemen or lost someone in the World Trade Center, and we can really bore in and just talk about how it affected Manhattan, when obviously it was a world-changing event. I think the paper has tried and I think often succeeded in trying to show how this changed, other countries. It's obviously one of the great legacies of 9/11, oddly enough, is Iraq. And what's happened to Iraq is, extraordinary and horrible in so many ways. And I don't know that American journalism has ever completely captured that, because it's a heck of a hard story to report. It's something we can do now.
But just so you know, we could have on this panel a bunch of our foreign reporters who've done a lot of these stories about, from the outside U.S. perspective. Obviously, there's always more we could do, but it's not like this is just one sampling of some of our coverage. Can you do a quick answer to the Abu Ghraib question, since you're military?
Well, there's no doubt that Abu Ghraib was the worst nightmare. We were talking earlier about the image control the Pentagon and the United States government tries to impose, and there couldn't have been anything worse. It solidified feelings that it was that it was a terrible mission, and that the American troops were abusive. I think that it probably made it easier for people's positions to harden. If you already thought that American soldiers were prone to torture people, and that seemed like pretty clear evidence of it.
That's great. Let's go up there.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking with us. My name is Matt. I'm a first-year MPP. I used to work for the American Red Cross, and we did a survey in April. It wasn't intended to be a 10-year retrospective, but it was a survey on American attitudes and beliefs towards the rules of war, how we should act in war. And the most striking thing that we found, actually, was that the young demographic, 13 to 18, really latched on to the idea that torture was okay, more so than the rest of the population. We found about 60% of youth and young adults found that that was okay. About 41% believed in some circumstances or all circumstances that it was actually okay for the enemy to torture American soldiers. So I think a lot of sort of commentary after that latched on to this idea that young adults that had grown up in a very formative time were shaped by politics and the popular cultural response to 9/11.
That's very interesting.
Well, I'm sorry, that's a long setup, but the question is sort of, with that in mind, what do you think, little things like that may not be immediately obvious, what has changed within American culture, or what has emerged from 9/11 that's quite surprising to you based upon your beats? Thank you.
I mean, I think I don't have a grand thought on this, but I think there's no, in my mind, looking at the politics of America over the last decade, I think there is so much. There's always been a strain of sort of isolationism and American exceptionalism in our culture, and I think 9/11 probably in some ways, brought some of that to the fore, and we see that in our politics now more than ever. I think there's a sense among people that we are under attack. I think that results in the great suspicions of Muslims in our midst, and all you need is one wayward 18-year-old Muslim American kid to be thinking about shooting somebody, and it seems to, it just feeds that sense of, that we're a beleaguered country even more. So I mean, that to me is one factor.
Let's go up to you unless one of you wants.
I would just, one observation is just getting on a plane now. So before 9/11, it wasn't quite like what it is today. And also, I walk through Penn Station oftentimes, and I've now become accustomed to seeing soldiers with semi-automatic rifles. I'm here to tell you that wasn't the way it was before 9/11. And so I don't know what the long-term effect of having that as part of our culture now, but it's quite different,
Sir?
Yes, my name is Chevy Anwar. I am from Indonesia. I am Executive Director of International Center for Islam and Pluralism in Jakarta, and currently I am a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. My question is related to fighting against terrorism in the future, especially related with the role and function of journalism in fighting against terrorism. Why I said like this? Because as we have already known, as also stated by former Prime Minister Tony Blair, the war against terrorism is the war of ideas. And in this regard, we see the reality that there are a lot of problems dealing with fighting against terrorism. We know that cyber terrorism also taking place. And of course, in this regard, the role of journalism is quite important. I would like to ask your response, comment related to cyber terrorism and the development of the so-called self-radicalization, which create terrorism in the world. Thank you.
I think that's why the concern in communities about mosques going in is so misguided. Because one of the things that researchers have found is that, in fact, what he refers to as the war of ideas and the jihadism, it's not being taught in mosques. In fact, they're finding that youth who spend time in mosques are usually more immune to it. It is the solitary, alienated, looking for a purpose in life, young person sitting at their computer who, gets on Anwar al-Awlaki's site, or there are many of these jihadi sites, and who begins to, resonate with it. And we've seen in many of the cases where there are what you want to call homegrown terrorists here, where people have, have either usually it's an attempt at an incident. They have been on all over those jihadi sites on the internet. And in fact, there are efforts now, Muslim organizations are actually working with various agencies to try to do counter cyber, to engage in that war of ideas. First of all, sometimes it's blocking sites, sometimes it's creating new sites, but mostly getting out there, compelling teachers of Islam who are countering those messages, and who know the Quran, who can speak directly and really contradict what those jihadi sites are saying. So, in fact, that is even right after 9/11, the most interesting story I did was exactly about that. It was about one guy who's an actor in Los Angeles, and he was from Egypt, Saeed Badrea, and the only roles he had gotten in American films were as terrorists. He's a big guy with a big beard, and you could make him into someone who's kind of scary looking. And he went to Los Angeles looking for all kinds of acting jobs, but he kept getting typecast. And I remember sitting in his room. He had like a reel of clips from his films, and he said, this one I am hijacking TWA, this one I am a kidnapper, this one I am, and it went on like this. But the reason I mentioned him is he had come to the United States as a young man and fallen in love with this country, as many Muslim Americans have, and was passionate about wanting to defend the country. And he understood that it was a war of ideas. He wasn't signing up to go into the military. He wanted to use film to reach young people, Muslim young people, to counter the jihadi message. And he knew all about the jihadi message because at one point, he was pretty secular, but he was engaged in his faith. He decided to research his film roles and started hanging out with jihadis in Los Angeles. This was in 1992, before the first attack on the World Trade Center. And there were preachers coming through, bringing tapes of Osama bin Laden, even then. And he played me tapes of Osama bin Laden, and he was translating them to me, and he was saying, this is like poetry. This is so beautiful. If I were a young, alienated Muslim immigrant, I would be taken in with this. And so he was saying, we have to find ways to speak to that, to have our own beautiful poetic tapes that are just as beautiful as what Osama bin Laden is putting out. And I think the US government has been very slow to recognize this and also to employ the people, to enlist the people who can most help them, which are Muslim Americans, because they've been, there's been some tentativeness about who can we trust here, who should we work with. But in fact, you need, and especially you need the scholars, you need the jurists, you need them to work with you to work on that war of ideas. Because I do agree with you, that's the level that the war is at.
Okay, let's.
Thank you very much. I'm Sitza Gofard. I'm a freshman at Harvard College. 9/11 was obviously one of the most significant events our country has ever been through, and certainly one of the biggest stories many journalists, including I'm sure most of you, have ever had to cover. What went through your mind as you began to write this story about this life-changing and extremely devastating story? And did you find it difficult to do it any sort of justice in your stories?
Dan?
What went through my mind? I have to say the first thing that went through my mind was to tell the story, to find a story, to find some small aspect of this momentous moment and to tease it out and to report the hell out of it, and then through that find some larger truth that helps other people understand what's happening here. So I'm representing readers, I'm representing my friends. I'm in a position of privilege in a weird way because I get to go to ground zero. But so that I'm aware of that. I just want to tell stories that elucidate. That's my first mission. And then as I said earlier, the grieving or the emotional aspect will come later on, when I'm alone. And what was the second part of the question?
Did you find it difficult to do to do 9/11 any sort of justice? Because it's such obviously a huge and life-changing event. How do you start writing about that?
Yeah, I would say we probably didn't do it. I think we did the best we could, but it was so large that we probably missed various aspects of it. We did the best we could, but I think we're human too, and we were all affected by it, and we're trying to put our emotions aside and find the story. I think we did all right, but I think you're onto something that we could have done more. We missed stories.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Liara Falk. I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy student and a reporter, although I guess right now I'm a full-time student. And I was wondering how you saw how the New York Times national coverage differed from the national coverage of other national newspapers by virtue of the Times also being a New York paper.
You mean related to 9/11? Or,
Yes, sorry.
Well, I think Washington, the Washington Post focused, their avenue into it was the Pentagon. Do you know what I mean? And so the Pennsylvania papers in Philadelphia focused on Shanksville, but I think that everybody saw New York as, everything was through the reflection of New York, ultimately. And so I have to say I was so immersed in it. I haven't gone to the museum in Washington ever. I know they have a big display of how everyone else covered it, but honest to God, I wasn't thinking about it, you know.
I was in Washington at the time, but I do think because the Times is based in New York and because the story was focused in New York, I think we felt an extra responsibility. Probably if it had been in Chicago, we would have sent, platoons of people there. But something about New York and the city where we're based and just gave us probably an extra feeling of responsibility.
But we also had great coverage in Kodiak Island.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Spotless.
Yes.
Wonder what your take is on...
And could you identify yourself?
Sorry, my name is Jennifer Hollett. I'm a mid-career student in the MPA program, and I'm wondering what the panel's take is on the popularity of 9/11 conspiracy theories.
Well, I was at the beach on vacation, and my 18, there was a bunch of teenagers there, and they had this big fight one night, and I was talking to my son, and I was like, what was going on? Actually, two people came to blows, and it turns out one of them, who's a freshman at college out in Oregon, was talking up a 9/11 conspiracy, and the other kids were beating him down, I guess. I don't know exactly what happened. But I was just fascinated by that because, I'm sure Dan gets far more of this than well, maybe Laurie too, but I've always gotten emails from people saying, you're missing the truth. And I've written it off, and they seem to have died down. And then there was this kid who's a freshman out at a very good school, and a bright kid who was...
So you're both also being inundated with...
Well, given what I cover, I'm kind of steeped in conspiracy thinkers. I think they have a direct line in my telephone. But I was downtown just last year, and there was a huge march of people who were demanding an open investigation into who really brought down the towers. And it was a big march. It was several hundred people, and they needed police. And I don't know, what organization, was sponsoring it, but I was surprised to see that many people out in the streets demanding an investigation. One of the communities that the conspiracy theories were very alive in was a Muslim community. And it was not everywhere, but it was pockets. And I came to realize that, part of it was just absolute disbelief that it could have been Muslims who did this because it was so obviously bad for Muslims. That's how they saw it. So there must have been some other cause. And that's why you got what, people really was one of the most offensive theories was that Israel must have done it. Or, the Bush administration must have orchestrated this. Because they could not believe this was so obviously bad, not just for Muslim Americans, but also for Muslim countries, Arab countries. They knew right away that this was not going to be good for them. And so I think part of the conspiracy theories came out of that.
Dan, do you want to jump in? Or?
No, I'll leave the conspiracy theories.
All right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Gina Hackett. I'm a freshman at Harvard College and aspiring New York Times journalist. And my question, I recently heard of a piece, an AP piece, that was on what the NYPD has done post 9/11 to ramp up security in that. And part of it focused on how they have special demographic units that send investigators out into primarily Muslim neighborhoods to monitor suspicious activity in that. And I'm wondering if you think there's a place for that kind of stereotypical investigation in the wake of American Islamophobia today.
Jim?
You're kidding me. You cover the cops.
I think you too.
You know,
You're
when
going to be a
when-
good journalist.
You
That's a
are.
good
That,
question.
it's a very good question.
No
And yeah, and I don't know. I don't even know my own mind on it. I'll be honest about that. But when the hearings earlier this year that Representative Peter King held about the you know, the Islamic, you know, terrorist threat and the threat of homegrown terrorism. When those were happening, we did some kind of setup stories about ways in, you know, was it the case that the Muslim community was cooperating or not cooperating with law enforcement? And I was surprised at the amount of open cooperation that there was. That especially, I mean, I went out to Los Angeles, which has been sort of setting the trend on this, where, you know, the police department and, you know, all levels of law enforcement had open channels to Muslim organizations. And, you know, that went everything from mosques to schools. And, you know, there was also a lot of wariness on the part of, you know, Muslim communities to work with law enforcement, because there have been a lot of people who've been deported on immigration charges because they've been, you know, caught up as suspected or something, and so the easiest thing to do with them is just to, you know, deport them. So there is some reluctance to work with law enforcement. But what I found was that what the AP story was about was in some ways about more of an infiltration program, more than an open cooperation program.
I've been told that we have to cut this off, but I want to give everyone a chance who's standing, who's been waiting, to ask a quick question, and we'll get quick lightning round answers. Sir?
All right, well, you guys talked a little bit about...
And identify you.
Sorry, my name's Jacob Feldman. I'm a student at Harvard College as well. I'm curious, you guys talked a little bit about how a lot of youth felt this strong sense of patriotism and wanting to do something for their country, and I'm wondering how strong that sense of patriotism was palpable in the newsroom and whether that affected your coverage, especially in the lead up to the Iraq War. And it seemed like there was, usually journalists would kind of value their skepticism towards government, and whether that kind of took a back seat to patriotism immediately following 9/11 and up through the Iraq War.
Who wants to take?
Well, I mean, I can say that, you know, I think, just speaking for myself, but I think this is true of other journalists at the time, was that, you know, you could feel upset and angry at what had happened without thinking that the administration was doing the right way, was responding in the right way. You know, I mean, I think you could easily, wasn't hard, at least for me, to divorce those two thoughts. You know, certainly, you know, the way they went to war and the invasion of Iraq and the way that was done, you didn't have to stop feeling terrible about 9/11 to be critical of the way.
But
those
we
things
were
handled.
criticized by some people for being too hard on the administration or whatever, because saying we weren't patriotic, that was kind of used against by some of our critics. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Paul Perez, and I'm a MPA student here at the Kennedy School. We spoke a lot today of how New Yorkers or New Yorkans and other U.S. citizens reacted post 9/11, especially how they became very suspicious of other U.S. citizens of Middle Eastern descent or heritage. Did you find that post 9/11 there was a similar reaction from even tourists that were in the United States visiting from other countries right after the event? Were they also suspicious of other Middle Eastern U.S. citizens or whatnot?
I was in New York.
And I don't know.
Dan, you were in New York.
Your question is whether tourists were also suspicious?
So I'm curious, you know, in light of the information that came out right after the attack, and we saw that U.S. citizens were very suspicious of other Middle Easterners, especially in the United States. But were those tourists from Europe, for instance, did you find that they also had a very similar reaction, or was their reaction to 9/11 much different from those citizens of the U.S.?
I can't tell you. I know that New York City was empty for a while. That's all I know. I don't know how European tourists looked, as you're suggesting. I don't know.
Sir.
Hi, good evening. I'm Pravir Ranjan. I'm a Lee Kuan Yew Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. My question is, do you think post 9/11 American politics has become more reactionary than ever? And it has assumed too much of a moral responsibility on its side?
Yeah, Rick.
No, I'm the moderator. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know, why am I answering this? But,
Because we're not.
reactionary is not a word we would use on this
Yeah,
panel as New York Times
it's
reporters.
impossible.
Obviously, it's grown. It's the most divisive and contentious of any time I can remember.
But
whether that's a result
whether
of
that's
9/11.
related to 9/11, it's hard to. I mean, 9/11 was the one time the country kind of came together. I mean, it seems politically, and which brings us to one story that I'd like to tell about a story I did, actually, if you'll indulge me for 2 seconds.
It's all about you.
It's all about me. So when I was a political reporter during all this period after 9/11, I was like searching for angles for stories to write. And it was hard because everyone was like in Congress and everyone was like getting along. Everyone loved President Bush's numbers went up. You're looking for tension in politics. So I don't know if you remember, but Bush did a joint session of Congress and he got, total, he got real support from both parties. And I noticed in watching it that he hugged Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader, but he didn't. To me, it showed it was a symbol of how everyone was getting along so well. But I noticed that he didn't hug Trent Lott, who was a Republican leader, even though they're both in the same party. So I called both those people, and people think you do trivial stories, but I was trying to capture the politics of everyone getting along so well. And I asked Daschle, why did you hug the president? He said, well, was that too much? Was I okay? I said, no, I'm just curious. And then I asked Lott, I said, I talked to, and I said, Senator, why did, I just couldn't help but notice, the president hugged Daschle, but didn't hug you. And so Lott's response was, well, it wasn't really the president hugging Daschle, it was Daschle hugging him. And then he said, and I'm just not a hugger anyway. But he was trying to justify why he didn't get a hug. And it turned out, those symbols have meaning, because it turns out that the president did not like his Republican leader. And for a moment, a very short time, he and the Democrats were getting along pretty well. That all sort of changed not too long after that. But thanks for letting me tell my little story. Yes?
I'm Jonathan Simon. I'm the director of the Center for Global Health and Development at Boston University. And my question for the panel is to ask you to look inward as journalists for the Times, as the newspaper of record and one of the great newspapers in the world, and ask yourself whether your reporting over the past decade has helped us have the national conversation on the role of Islam, or have the national conversation on religious tolerance in this country. And I guess my question is, looking back over the 10 years of reporting, what would you have done different? And how might the reporting of the Times over the next 10 years leave us in a better place on some of the war of ideas and some of the issues that you set forth?
Laurie.
Writing about religion, I'm often asked to write about theology. I'll get calls from people who are, believers in one faith or another, and say, why don't you tell the real story, which is that whatever is my faith is the true faith, and explicate the theology. And I don't do that because, my job is to report how people live out their faith, but not to be an advocate for one faith or another. The only time I have really gone into try to explicating faiths and what faiths say is with Islam. Because there has been, 9/11 set off this national conversation that is almost the question was, is Islam bad? Is it evil? What do the texts say? What does the Quran say? And this is a conversation that Americans are having. And in some ways, the people who are providing the answers, who are most in circulation, are people who have an agenda. And that agenda is an anti-Islam agenda. I mean, at one point, I looked at the Amazon list of, when you look at what are the best-selling books on Islam, the 3 out of the top 10 were by people who are in this industry of, countering Islam. They were not sort of informative, neutral books about Islam, and they were not by Islamic scholars either. They were by, 3 of them were by Robert Spencer. I don't know if you know that author, but he and Pamela Geller really helped orchestrate the the fight against the Ground Zero Mosque, saying that it was a, front for, a plant for Islam, Islamic triumphalism, all that. So it's one of the rare times that I have, tried to be helpful by going to Islamic scholars and saying, what does the, what do the scriptures say? And trying to, popularize, those ideas. And I think that in general the media needs to do more of that because there's not a responsible discussion, I think, going on right now about what does Islam teach, what is it really about? What do its believers believe, and how do they live their lives? Sometimes it's not so much the level of scripture as to how people live. Right. So I'd like to see more of that. I don't quite know how to do it, but I do it, the best I can.
Jim, quick.
Well, I just want to point out that the Times won a Pulitzer a couple of years ago for a series on an imam in Brooklyn, I believe, right?
Yeah.
It was a long, several very, very long stories about what his life was like and trying to, be an imam and dealing with anti-Muslim views.
Final question.
My name is David Skok. I'm a Neiman Fellow this year. Just a quick question to try and bookend it here about, for the last 9 years of the anniversaries, Osama bin Laden was alive, and how that specter will hang over this particular anniversary, and how New Yorkers, how you think New Yorkers will react or feel this year with his killing.
Dan?
The question is, how do I think New Yorkers will feel with the 10th anniversary? I've always had issues with anniversary stories, and I've written about what's the difference between the 4th anniversary and the 5th anniversary of your grief, and of that traumatic moment. What's the difference between 1 year and a year and a half? And so my question with the 10th anniversary is, I hope that people will have processed it and look on it not only as a historic moment, but a moment that has reverberations to this night and going forward. I also, we've been talking about how we have a 16-page commemorative package about 9/11, and I can't imagine sitting and reading it. And I mean that, because it's a combination of what are they going to tell me, or it's too painful. And I think that's a wrong approach. I think I am going to read it because that's part of the process, looking at it in new ways. And the question that preceded yours, about seeing how we do this better. For my money, it would be with a much more multicultural voice in the future, and seeing how it affects many peoples and not just, as Jim says, firefighters. You know what I mean? So I have trouble with the 10th anniversary concept, but I also understand as a society, that's how we pause and take measure, and then we move forward. It's kind of a false thing, but it's a necessary thing.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.